Something we talk about a lot in government spending here on FM News Talk 97.1. The question is, how do you control it? I mean, quite frankly, this is my experience, when people run for re-election, oftentimes they're running on their record. And they have to have something to show you, and oftentimes it is things that have added to the size of government. There's no way to get around that. Occasionally, an idea comes down the pike that would pretty much freeze things where they are. How about that? Senator-elect Bill Eigel joining us from the 23rd Senate District out in St. Charles County. Bill, how are you?
Great, Mark. Thanks for having me this afternoon.
Hey, glad you could join us, and Merry Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas to you as well, and to all your listeners.
Well, thank you very much. Let's see, the Stop Government Growth Act. You filed this, you pre-filed this bill, is that correct?
That's correct. It's SJR 12, and the Stop Government Growth Act would do what, as you mentioned, many politicians talk about doing during the campaign season, but always have a hard time actually getting accomplished once they're in office. And the Stop Government Growth Act would actually restrict the growth of government spending in the state of Missouri to previous year levels, plus some small adjustments for inflation and population growth.
So it's almost like baseline budgeting.
Exactly.
Right?
It's actually based on a law that Colorado passed a few years back, and they've had a lot of success limiting the growth of their government since they passed their Taxpayer Bill of Rights back in 2004.
So how would that work with the Hancock Amendment? Doesn't that say if government takes in more than X amount of dollars over what it's spending, they have to send that back to the taxpayer?
It does, and unfortunately, a lot of time those balances get put back into the general revenue fund, and it never ends up in a check that goes back to Missouri taxpayers. And although there's a couple reasons for that, what the Stop Government Growth Act will do will set an actual baseline for expenditures that the legislature can appropriate in any given year, and any surpluses above that level will automatically be rolled into income tax cuts over the long term, so every Missourian that's paying taxes benefits from those surpluses in the future.
Wow. What's the reaction been to it so far, Bill?
Well, it's been very positive. We just had an extraordinary election, and the message that I heard and a lot of folks heard was that folks are really disappointed and not happy with the direction of their government. They're not interested in bigger government programs, more wasteful spending. And we see that at the federal level with programs like Obamacare that have caused a lot of overreach and way more spending than we need. And we also see it at the state level. Right now, we're having a conversation about whether we should be dedicating public tax dollars to sports stadiums and millionaires so that they can have a new stadium for sports teams. So we see a lot of the spending in many different ways. And the reaction I'm getting is incredibly positive that finally we're going to have a way to really restrain that growth and ensure that we're prioritizing the tax dollars better than we ever have before.
So tell me how this bill would impact that, though. If would it somehow prevent the state of Missouri from issuing state tax credits toward a stadium in St. Louis? I mean, it wouldn't directly address that, would it?
Well, not directly. It doesn't try to set remaining spending priorities. What it does is it basically tells the government, you can spend this amount of money, which is equal to what you spent last year, plus a little bit of an adjustment for inflation,
right,
population growth, and you have to do a better job prioritizing what's important to the state and what really falls within the role of government. So that'll set up an environment where, quite frankly, we don't have extra money and more and continually increasing dollars to spend on special interest projects like the soccer stadium that we've been talking about recently, or before that, it was a new stadium for the Rams.
I talked to former Speaker Tim Jones the other day. We had a conversation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but right now, Missouri is looking at a couple of $100 million deficit, aren't they?
They are.
In the budget. And they got to figure out a way to correct that. Which probably won't be a problem if you look at the overall scope of the budget that we have. But moving forward, something like this could really help.
Absolutely. And when you talk about this overall scope of our budget, Mark, right now we're sending $27 billion to Jefferson City to be spent every year. That's more sacrifice than the citizens of Missouri have ever made in the history of our state. So every year, there's more and more dollars being taken out of the pockets of everyday Missourians and being spent on government programs. And a lot of times, these priorities don't match up with what I would describe as the proper role of government, and they don't describe the priorities that the people have their tax dollars spent on.
Yeah.
Stadiums we can talk about all day long, corporate welfare, but this is really the catalyst that's going to force the General Assembly to prioritize what's important, be that roads, be that education, and really cut out all the waste elsewhere in the budget.
Yeah. What form would this take? Would it be an amendment to the Constitution?
Absolutely. So as an amendment to the Constitution, if we can get this through the legislature, it would go on the ballots, and the people themselves would have to decide if they want to continue restraining the growth of government. Based on the results we got in the most recent election, I would be very optimistic that something like that would pass at the ballot box.
I think we should call it the Eigel Act.
Well,
come on, the Hancock Amendment, the Eigel Amendment. You'd be ensconced in stone up there in Jeff City somewhere. That'd be great.
If somehow my name gets associated with restraining government growth, I wouldn't argue with that. But really, the message is just getting control of a budget that's grown by a third just since 2010.
Yeah, that's great. We're talking to Senator-elect Bill Eigel from the 23rd Senate District. Bill, I know that meetings have already been held, and there's already discussion about the agenda for the new legislature with a new governor who's sort of on our side as opposed to the old one who wouldn't do anything. Where would you stack the top 3 or 4 issues for action once you get back to Jeff City?
Yeah, great question. And I think that some of these are not going to come as a surprise to you. The number one issue that we're talking about right now has to do with labor reform. And labor reform is a handful of bills that include right-to-work legislation so that we can compete in a work environment with other states that have already passed that legislation. Paycheck protection, I think we're going to take a look at prevailing wage law reform as well. So we're going to make probably more progress on real labor reform in the next legislative session than we have maybe in the past decade. So I'm very excited about that. After that, I think comes tort reform. You know, I'm a small business owner, and I've been the victim of frivolous lawsuits here in Missouri, and so we're going to take some action in terms of that's getting lawsuits out of the way of business. That's getting the legal environment out of the way of business so we can create new jobs. And we're going to be tackling that issue, I think, sooner rather than later. And, you know, there are a couple other issues out there, whether it's ethics reform. You know, Governor-elect Greitens has spoke at length about what he's looking for in terms of ethics reform. I'm supportive of several of his initiatives, whether it's banning lobbyist gifts, whether it's increasing the amount of time legislators have to take before they can become lobbyists. These are all things that are designed to address and increase the trust that people have with their legislative leaders. So I'm excited to get started, but it's going to be a great year, and I feel like my timing is great.
Yeah, no kidding. I would think that it's sort of been a watershed year for reforms like this. The environment should be good for it. Very quick, let me pivot back to SB 5, which changed a lot of how municipal courts act. Can fine people and that sort of thing in St. Louis, or across the state for that matter. I've been told there's a negative side effect to that these small cities are using this as an excuse that they can't provide as many police officers, and therefore the burden is being pushed back on St. Louis County police officers to fill the void. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I haven't heard that out here in St. Charles County. You know, the Senate Bill 5 was designed to prevent abuse, and so it placed a new limit and a new restriction on what government could do. Because in many instances, and I won't name names, but in many instances, I think you have municipalities that were using traffic enforcement as a way to generate revenue.
I would agree.
I'm supportive of placing restrictions on that type of abuse. So I think that we're in the right mindset, and I don't know of any situations out here in St. Charles where that additional limitation is going to prevent us from fielding the police officers that we need to keep us all safe. If I hear of anything, certainly we'll address that, but I'm just not hearing that out in St. Charles.
Yeah, I didn't know if there had been any talk of maybe tweaking that bill this year or not, but I thought I'd at least ask. Good. Senator-elect Bill Eigel, didn't mean to put you on the spot there. I had that issue in the back of my mind because I had a conversation about it the other day. Have a Merry Christmas, and touch base with us once the legislature gets in session and give us an update on how things are going.
Sounds good, Mark. Thanks again for having me on. Merry Christmas to you, your family, and all your viewers, and we'll talk to you in the new year.
All right, Bill. Thank you very much. Senator-elect Bill Eigel there from the